The emergency room doors crashed open at 2:47 in the morning, and the man they carried in was drowning in his own blood. 6 feet of trained soldier, unconscious, a bullet buried somewhere in his chest cavity. And the surgeon standing over him had already made the wrong call. Nobody stopped him. Nobody except the quiet nurse in the corner who hadn't even finished her 3rd month on the job. She opened her mouth. He told her to get out. What Dr. Marcus Hale did not know, what none of them knew, was that the woman he just dismissed had once commanded the unit that man belonged to. Before we go any further, if this is your kind of story, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications so you never miss what's coming next. These stories drop fast, and they hit hard. Smash the like button if you're already hooked, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The rain had been falling on Harwich City for 6 hours straight by the time Nora Valdez clocked in for her night shift. She came in through the side entrance the way she always did, not because she was required to, but because the main lobby was loud at this hour, crowded with the kind of controlled chaos that most people found overwhelming. Nora didn't find it overwhelming. She found it familiar in a way she couldn't explain to anyone who hadn't lived it. The shouting, the lights, the bodies moving fast with specific purpose. It reminded her of places she didn't talk about anymore. She hung her badge on its lanyard, straightened it once, and walked toward the trauma wing of Harwich Central Hospital. The hospital itself sat in the industrial corridor of the city, wedged between a freight rail yard and a neighborhood that city planners kept promising to revitalize. It wasn't the flagship location. That was Meridian General on the north side, glass and steel, and a helipad that got featured in the hospital's annual fundraising brochure. Harwich Central was the one that actually did the work. Gunshots, crashes, industrial accidents, overdoses, the full range of things that happen when people ran out of options or luck. The staff here were tired in a specific way that came from years of real emergencies, and most of them had stopped pretending otherwise. Nora had been here for 11 weeks. To the rest of the department, that made her a rookie. She was 31 years old, quiet, composed in a way that some people mistook for shyness. She kept her dark hair pulled back tight enough that it never moved, even when she was running. She didn't decorate her locker, didn't bring homemade food to share, didn't join the group texts the other nurses maintained to coordinate their social lives. She was polite. She was competent. She stayed out of the way. That last part was intentional. Pauline Marsh, the charge nurse who had been running night shifts at Harwich Central for 14 years, had given Nora a fair assessment during her 2nd week. "You're technically solid," Pauline had said, not unkindly, standing at the medication station with a clipboard pressed against her hip. "But you're careful, like you're measuring every step." "I am," Nora said. Pauline looked at her for a moment. "Most people who are that careful are either hiding something or afraid of something. Or they just don't want to cause problems," Nora said. Pauline had nodded, not entirely convinced, and walked away. The thing was, Nora wasn't afraid. She wasn't hiding exactly. She was recalibrating. 7 years in uniform had taught her a version of herself that didn't translate cleanly to a hospital floor. The directness, the speed of assessment, the instinct to act first and document later. Those habits had kept people alive in places where there was no trauma bay, no surgical team, no backup closer than 40 minutes by helicopter. But they didn't make her popular in an environment with hierarchy, protocols, and a chief attending who had built his reputation on the principle that authority flowed downward, always, without exception. Dr. Marcus Hale. She'd known within her 1st week that he was going to be a problem. He was 53, broad-shouldered in a way that had softened into bulk over the years, with silver at his temples that he clearly considered distinguished. He had trained at a prestigious program on the East Coast, completed fellowships at 2 institutions with names that got mentioned in grant applications, and arrived at Harwich Central 8 years ago with the kind of credentials that made hospital administration defer to him on almost everything. He was a skilled surgeon. She could see that in how he worked, the economy of his movements, the precision. But skill had curdled into certainty somewhere along the way, and certainty had curdled into something worse. He didn't just believe he was right. He had stopped checking. The first time they'd crossed paths clinically, it was a straightforward chest trauma case. a construction worker who'd fallen 2 stories and presented with respiratory distress. Nora had been reviewing the intake vitals when she noticed a pattern that concerned her. She'd flagged it to the resident on duty, who'd brought it to Hale, who'd looked at the note, looked at Nora, and said, "I appreciate the initiative, nurse. What's your name?" "Valdez." "Nurse Valdez, I've been reading chest x-rays since before you graduated high school. I'll let you know if I need a second opinion." The resident had looked at his shoes. Nora had said nothing. The patient had been fine. Hale's read had been correct that time, but the dynamic had been established in a way that didn't require words to be understood. She was new, she was quiet, she was the nurse. Those 3 facts formed the walls of the box she was expected to stay inside. Over the following weeks, she heard things in the break room and in the hallways, the way you hear things when people don't think you're listening. That Hale had pushed out a surgical resident 2 years ago for openly disagreeing with him during a case. That a senior nurse had filed a complaint about his conduct and found herself quietly reassigned to outpatient scheduling within the month. That the administration valued his department's metrics and his grant relationships enough to smooth over friction without examining it too closely. None of this surprised her. She had known men like Hale in other contexts, in other uniforms. The rank structure was different, but the psychology was identical. The belief that position conferred infallibility, that questioning was the same as undermining, that the person at the top of the hierarchy was automatically the most qualified person in the room. She had learned a long time ago that this belief got people killed. But she was starting over. She was building something new. She had made a deliberate choice to come here, to this city, to this specific environment where nobody knew her name or her file or what it had cost her to leave the life she'd had before. She was going to be careful. She was going to learn the landscape, understand the culture, earn the kind of trust that couldn't be dismissed. She had a plan. Then the ambulance bay doors opened at 2:47 in the morning, and the plan stopped mattering. Nora heard the radio call before she saw them. She was charting at the workstation near the end of the hall when the paramedic's voice came through. Gunshot wound, male, late 30s, entry wound left thoracic, blood pressure dropping through the floor. Estimated arrival 90 seconds. The voice on the radio was steady, but she heard the edge underneath it, the specific compression of tone that meant the person speaking had already done everything they could and they were handing off a problem that might not be solvable. She closed her chart and moved toward the bay. There were 4 of them. She counted before she saw the stretcher. 4 men in civilian clothes, each one of them built in a way that had nothing to do with a gym and everything to do with function. They moved like water around the paramedics, not obstructing, not performing, just present in a way that filled the space without announcing itself. 2 of them were scanning the hallway as they came through the doors. One had blood on his left forearm that didn't appear to be his. The 4th was holding the stretcher rail. The man on the stretcher was unconscious, broad through the shoulders, jaw tight, even in unconsciousness. The specific kind of physical stillness that came not from calm, but from a body that had redirected every remaining resource to the single project of staying alive. The paramedic's hands were pressing a trauma pad against his left side. The compression bandage underneath had already saturated. Hale appeared from the corridor at a near jog, already pulling on gloves. "Bay 2, he said, not looking at anyone in particular. "Everyone who doesn't have a role in this room, clear out." Nora moved into position on the left side. One of the men from the group, the one who had been holding the stretcher rail, looked at her. He didn't say anything. His eyes moved from her face to her hands and back. She had seen that look before. It was an assessment. Not aggressive, not suspicious. Clinical. He was deciding whether she was someone who could help. She gave him nothing back, just moved to her station. The patient came off the transport stretcher and onto the bay in a practice slide. 3 nurses, 2 paramedics, Hale calling the transfer. Nora caught the vitals sheet from the paramedic and read it in 3 seconds. Blood pressure, 74/48, heart rate 134, oxygen saturation 89 and falling. "Chest tube left side now," Hale said. "Let's get imaging." "He needs a cut down first," Nora said. The room didn't go silent exactly. It kept moving. The monitors connecting, a nurse running the IV line, someone pulling the surgical tray. But Hale's attention shifted to her with the specific quality of a man who was not used to being interrupted. "Excuse me?" Blood pressure is 74, systolic and dropping. If you tube him without addressing the vascular involvement first, you're going to lose the pressure entirely. He needs direct access to the subclavian. I can see the vitals, Nurse Valdez. His voice was flat and precise. I've been managing hemothorax since before you were licensed. I know, but look at the entry wound angle. I'm looking at the patient. He turned back to the tray. Chest tube. Left intercostal, 5th space. The room moved with him. This was how it worked. The attending spoke, and the room responded, because that was the system. Because the system existed for reasons that made sense most of the time. Nora stood at her position and watched him, and felt the clock in her head running. She had a clock in her head. She'd had it since her second deployment, when a trauma surgeon embedded with their unit had explained to her that the human body in hemorrhagic shock operated on a timeline that didn't negotiate. The blood pressure wasn't dropping gradually. It was dropping in steps, each one lower than the last, and at some point the heart would run out of road. She did the math in her head. They had 4 minutes, maybe 5. Doctor, she kept her voice level. The projectile path, look at the entry angle, lower left, tracking upward. That's not just intercostal tissue. He has subclavian involvement. Hale didn't look up from his preparation. Speculative. It's not speculative, it's geometry. Now he looked up. The room noticed. Did you just correct my clinical assessment? She held eye contact. I gave you additional information. Something moved across his face. Not doubt, not consideration, but a kind of hardening. The expression of a man who had decided that the thing happening in front of him was a challenge to his authority and was processing it accordingly. Nurse Valdez, you've been in this department for 11 weeks. You went to nursing school, not medical school. I am the attending physician in this trauma bay. You are here to execute orders, not issue them. He picked up the chest tube. Now step back or leave the room. The nurses who had been watching from the periphery of their tasks found somewhere else to look. Nora felt the specific weight of the moment, the calculation she'd been trained to make, not in a classroom, but in the field, where the options were always imperfect and the cost of being wrong ran in one direction only. She stepped back. 1 step. She kept her eyes on the monitors. The chest tube went in. Hale worked with the proficiency she had already acknowledged. Fast, clean, accurate to the intercostal space. The drainage was immediate, blood and air evacuating from the left pleural space in a dark rush. The oxygen saturation ticked up. For about 90 seconds, it looked like he'd been right. Then the blood pressure dropped again. Not gradually. In a step. 74 to 61 in the space of a single monitor cycle. One of the other nurses said, Doctor, his pressure, I see it. Hale was already moving, reaching for the next instrument. Vasopressors. It won't hold. Nora was already at the head of the bed. You have active arterial bleed. The vasopressors will buy you maybe 90 seconds of pressure before the vessel tears completely. You need to open him. You need to open him right now or he dies on this table. The monitor alarm went off. Heart rate 152. Blood pressure 58/40. The room froze in the specific way that rooms freeze when the sound changes from urgent to critical, when the monitors stop being background noise and become the loudest thing in the space. Hale stood at the side of the bed with the pressure syringe in his hand, and something moved through his face. Not uncertainty, not yet, but the first hairline crack in certainty, the moment when the numbers stopped being abstract. And then one of the men from the group took a step forward. He was the one who had been scanning the hallway. He was 6'2", close-cropped dark hair, a 2-day beard that hadn't been grown for style. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but it filled the room the way voices do when they're accustomed to being the last word in a situation. Doc, she's right. Hale looked at him. Sir, I need you to... She's right. Stop wasting time. Something in the delivery, not aggression, just absolute load-bearing certainty, landed differently than anything Nora had said. Maybe it was the way he was standing. Maybe it was something in his eyes, or the fact that he'd been managing the edges of the room with the kind of spatial awareness you didn't get from an office. Maybe Hale simply heard it differently coming from a man. Whatever it was, Hale set down the syringe and reached for the surgical kit. Nora was already there. She moved without announcing it, gloves, instruments positioned, retraction ready. She had done this in conditions that made this trauma bay look like a surgical suite at a teaching hospital. She had done this on dirt floors and in the backs of vehicles, and once, memorably, in a drainage ditch in the dark with a headlamp duct taped to a rifle stock. She had done it with her hands shaking, and she had done it with her hands perfectly steady, and she had learned that the difference between the two had almost nothing to do with fear. Hale worked. She assisted. But in the first 40 seconds, as the vessel came into view, a subclavian branch, torn at the junction exactly where she'd said it would be, she heard his breathing change, the small sound of a man recalculating. "Clamp," he said. She had it in his hand before he finished the word. "Suture. 4-0. Already there, he worked for 6 minutes. The room worked around him in the concentrated silence of a team doing what it had trained to do. The blood pressure moved. 58, 64, 71, 76. Not fast, but in the right direction. At the 9-minute mark, the vascular bleed was controlled. At 11 minutes, the patient's pressure stabilized at 88 systolic, and the monitor alarm stopped. Nora stepped back and let out a breath through her nose, slow and even, the kind of breath that didn't look like anything. Hale stripped his outer gloves and set them on the tray. He didn't say anything for a long moment. The room was recalibrating. The specific shift in atmosphere that follows a near miss, when people start breathing differently and you can hear it. Then he turned to Nora. She thought for 1 second that he was going to say something real, something that acknowledged what had happened. "You're out of this room," he said. "Go chart your portion of the intake. We'll discuss your conduct in the morning." "Understood," she said. She didn't argue. She pulled her gloves, dropped them in the waste bin, and walked toward the door. One of the other nurses, a woman named Deja, who had been at Harwick Central for 3 years and had never once challenged Hale in public, caught Nora's eye as she passed and gave her a look that contained the specific combination of admiration and apology that people give when they watch someone absorb a consequence they couldn't help prevent. Nora acknowledged it with a small nod and kept walking. She was 3 steps from the door when the man with the close-cropped hair moved into her path, not blocking her, just present, close enough that stopping was the natural thing to do. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. Up close, she could see that the cut on his forearm was deeper than she'd initially assessed. It needed closure, probably 4 or 5 sutures, and he'd been ignoring it for what looked like at least an hour based on the dried margin. "You need that sutured," she said. "I know." He kept looking at her. "You knew exactly where that bleed was." It wasn't a question. "Entry angle plus vital pattern," she said. "It was straightforward. Not for everyone in that room." She held his gaze. "Your teammate is stable. That's what matters." "Who are you?" The question was direct in a way that suggested he already suspected the answer wasn't going to be simple. She'd heard that directness before. It was the kind of question that people asked when they'd already run out of the kind of patience required for indirect answers. "Nora Valdez," she said, "trauma nurse, Harwick Central." He studied her for another moment. There was something in his face now. Recognition, maybe, or the beginning of it. The way a person looks when a piece of information is trying to connect to something else and not quite making it. "Valdez," he said. She waited. "You were Army." It wasn't a guess. She didn't ask how he knew. She said, "Before." He nodded once, the specific nod of a person filing information. "I'm going to need to come back to that. Your arm first." He almost smiled. It didn't fully complete. "Yeah, okay." She took him to one of the side examination bays and spent 8 minutes putting 5 sutures into the cut on his forearm. He sat still the way people sat still when they'd had things stitched up before and had learned that moving made it take longer. He didn't talk much. She didn't either. The sounds of the trauma wing filtered through the partition. The monitors, the radio check from the ambulance bay, someone down the hall asking for a blood draw. When she tied off the last suture and reached for the bandaging, he said, "His name is Calvin Reese, the man in Bay 2. "I know, I saw the intake. He's the best operator I've served with in 11 years. She pressed the bandage down and smoothed the tape at the edges. "Then I'm glad he's going to be okay. Because of you. Because of everyone in that room." He looked at her. Don't do that. She met his eyes. Excuse me? The deflection. You can do it with other people, not with me. He said it without heat, without challenge. Just a flat statement, the way you stated something that didn't require argument. You made the call. You pushed back when it was easier not to. You did it knowing what it was going to cost you. He paused. What did he say when you walked out? That we'd discuss my conduct in the morning. Which means I'm probably off the schedule by Tuesday. He was quiet for a moment. She started cleaning the workspace, rolling the used materials toward the disposal tray. What did you do before? He asked. I told you before nursing before nursing and before Army, he said. Specifically. She stopped. She looked at him carefully. The set of his jaw, the way he'd been running the edges of every space he'd entered tonight, the way he'd looked at her arm placements during the procedure with the particular attention of someone who was calculating, not observing. That's a longer conversation, she said. We're going to have it. He glanced toward the direction of Bay 2, but not tonight. She started to respond, and then the overhead lights went out. Not a flicker. Not a partial failure. The entire wing dropped to emergency power in a single cut. The fluorescent ceiling tiles replaced immediately by the red-tinged backup strip lighting along the floor, the monitors cycling through their brief shutdown and restart sequence. Someone in the hallway said, "What the?" And then the fire alarm began. Nora was on her feet before the second pulse. She stepped out of the examination bay into the hallway and read the environment in the 3 seconds she had before it became complicated. Emergency lighting, staff starting to move toward their assigned stations, 2 of the SEAL team members already in motion toward Bay 2 with their hands in positions that had nothing to do with a fire evacuation. She grabbed the man with the sutures by the shoulder. That's not a fire. He was already moving with her. No, it's not. Someone cut the mains. Fuse box is in the basement. Whoever took the power knew the layout. She processed that in half a second. Knew the layout meant they'd had time. Knew the layout meant this wasn't opportunistic. Someone had tracked the team from wherever the operation had gone wrong, tracked them here, to this building, in the last hour, and they had been patient enough to wait until the building was running on its overnight skeleton crew to make their move. Calvin Reese was on a surgical table in Bay 2. How many? She said. We don't know yet. Your team? 4 of us. 2 are with Cal. 1's on the north stairwell. He pulled something from inside his jacket. She didn't look directly at it. Which leaves me. That's not enough. No, he agreed. It's not. She thought for exactly 2 seconds. Then she said, Where's your north stairwell position? He looked at her. I know this building, she said. I've been walking it for 11 weeks, every floor, every corridor, every access point. She held his gaze. That was intentional. His expression shifted. The recognition she'd seen trying to form earlier finally landing. Something in his eyes rearranged itself. Sergeant First Class Nora Valdez, he said. 75th Ranger Regiment, detached to JSOC, 2017 through 2022. She didn't confirm it. She didn't deny it. North stairwell, she said again. He told her. She was already moving when he reached for his radio, and behind them, in the red-lit hallway of Harwick Central Hospital's trauma wing, the sound of the emergency door at the end of the corridor opened with a bang. Not a slam, not an accident, but the deliberate percussive entry of people who had stopped pretending they were there for any other reason. Nora didn't run. She moved fast, which was different, and the night, which had started badly for Dr. Marcus Hale, was about to get considerably worse for everyone in it, including several people who had made the serious mistake of assuming that the quietest person in the building was also the least dangerous one. The door hit the wall at the end of the corridor with enough force that the impact carried through the floor, a vibration Nora felt in the soles of her shoes before she heard the footsteps follow it. 2 sets, maybe 3, moving fast but not sprinting, controlled entry, the kind of movement that came from training, not adrenaline. These weren't opportunists. They'd done this before, in other buildings, on other nights, and they knew the difference between covering ground quickly and burning out before they reached the objective. She knew that difference too. Nora cut left at the first junction, away from the main trauma corridor, into the narrower service hallway that ran parallel to the patient bays. The backup lighting here was worse. A single strip along the baseboard, enough to navigate by if you already knew the layout, useless if you didn't. She'd walked this hallway 40 times. She knew the bend at the 18-meter mark, knew the supply closet door that stuck on its track unless you lifted the handle at the same time, knew the junction at the far end that opened to the north stairwell access through a door that wasn't marked on the public floor plan. Behind her, she could hear the man with the sutured arm. Briggs, he'd said his name was, somewhere in the last 90 seconds, though she hadn't been tracking names closely, moving with the specific kind of controlled quiet that took years to build. He wasn't asking questions. He'd made his assessment and committed, which meant he trusted her read of the terrain, which meant he understood, at least provisionally, that she knew what she was doing. She'd get into how he'd made that determination later. Right now, she had a corridor to navigate and an injured operator in a surgical bay and a building full of nurses and overnight patients who had no idea the night had changed shape. The supply closet door was 8 feet ahead. She slowed, put her hand on the handle, lifted and pushed simultaneously. It opened. She pulled Briggs through and let it close behind them. 3 seconds of absolute quiet. Then footsteps passed in the main corridor outside. She felt them more than heard them, the rhythm of 2 people moving with purpose, pausing at the junction, then continuing toward the trauma bays. Going straight for Bay 2. Briggs had his radio at his mouth, barely a breath of sound. Tanner, north access. How many on your side? The response came back fragmented, the signal degraded in the basement power failure. She caught the words 2 and elevator shaft, and then static. He's cut off, Briggs said. What's between them and Cal's Bay? Moore and Civic are inside with him. They'll hold the door, but they won't be able to hold it long if there are more than 2 on that approach. Nora thought. She mapped the building in her head the way she'd been mapping buildings since her second deployment, when a company sergeant had sat her down and told her that terrain was the only thing you could rely on when everything else went sideways. Know the ground better than the enemy knows the ground, he'd said, and you've already won half the argument. She'd taken it seriously. She'd taken everything seriously, which was part of why she'd ended up in the roles she'd ended up in, and also part of why leaving had been as complicated as it was. But that was a different problem. There's a service corridor that connects to the back of Bay 2 from the east, she said. Staff use it for equipment transfers so they don't cross the main floor. It's not on the standard floor plan, but it's on the infrastructure schematic. If they did their reconnaissance from building permits or public records, they don't know it exists. Briggs looked at her in the red-edged dark. You're saying we can flank them? I'm saying we can get to Cal's Bay from a direction they're not covering yet, but we need to move in the next 2 minutes before they finish mapping the main approach. He didn't deliberate. She'd noticed that about him. He processed fast and he committed cleanly, without the pause that some people needed to reassure themselves they'd made the right call. She'd worked with people like that. She'd also worked with people who couldn't commit, who held the decision a beat too long, and she knew exactly what that extra beat cost. Lead, he said. She led. The service corridor was accessed through a door disguised as a wall panel near the biomedical equipment storage, a design choice from the original construction that had survived every renovation because the engineers kept forgetting it was there. Nora had found it during her 3rd week when she'd been looking for a faster route between the supply room and the south bays. She'd noted it and filed it away in the part of her brain that cataloged exits and alternatives, the part that had never really turned off even when she'd traded her uniform for scrubs. She moved through the panel and into the narrow access passage beyond. The smell was different here, industrial, old concrete, the particular staleness of a space that circulated air mechanically and had never been aired out by an open window. The passage was about 1.5 meters wide, enough for 2 people to move single file with equipment trolleys, lit by a safety light at the far end that pulsed green. She could hear the hospital above and around her, the muffled mechanical sounds of the building itself, the hum of the backup power system, and somewhere ahead, voices. She held up a fist. Briggs stopped. The voices were on the other side of the wall to her right. She pressed her back flat and tilted her head, pulling the sounds apart. Two male voices. Not panicked, controlled, low, communicating in what she recognized as terse operational shorthand. Not English. She spent 2 seconds placing the language, then another 2 deciding it didn't matter right now. "How close to the bay?" Briggs said against her ear, barely sound at all. She held up 2 fingers. 2 meters. Maybe less. He nodded. She moved again, slower now, placing each step with intention on the concrete floor. The green safety light at the end grew brighter. The voices moved with her, parallel, tracking the same direction through the wall, also moving toward Bay 2. Then she heard a third sound. It was soft, and it came from behind the panel door at the end of the passage, the one that opened directly into the back wall of Bay 2's equipment storage alcove. Someone was already at the door, from the inside. She stopped and looked back at Briggs, made a gesture, 2 fingers pointing to her eyes, then toward the door. He understood. He moved forward until he was at her shoulder. She reached for the door handle. 1 breath. 2. She pushed. The door opened into the alcove and Mora was on the other side of it with his weapon raised for approximately half a second before Briggs said his name in a tone that communicated everything necessary. And Mora lowered it with the specific controlled relief of a man who had been 3 pounds of trigger pressure from a serious mistake. "Clear on this side," Mora said. He was a compact man, dark-eyed, with a cut above his left ear that had been field-dressed with 2 strips of medical tape. Nora could see it had been done in a hurry, the tape running at a slight angle. "Sevik's at the main door. They're stacking outside." "How many?" 3 on the corridor approach. We heard at least 1 more on the floor below." "Tanner?" "Lost comms when the power went." Nora stepped past the alcove partition into the bay proper. The room had been partially secured. The crash cart had been rolled in front of the main door, which wouldn't stop anyone but would slow them down and create noise, which were the 2 things you needed when you were buying time. The surgical bay's backup lighting was better than the corridors, running off a dedicated medical circuit, and in the pale wash of it she could see Calvin Reese on the bay table with his chest packed and 2 drains running and a portable monitor displaying vitals that were stable but narrow. He was still unconscious. She crossed to the monitor, read his pressure and rate, checked the drain output. The numbers were holding. Not well, not with the kind of margin that let you breathe easily, but holding. Whatever Hale had repaired in there was intact, at least for now, as long as nobody disturbed the table or the lines or introduced a significant change in the patient's physiology. Things like, for example, a firefight 6 feet from his head. The man at the main door, Sevik, glanced back at her with an expression that was half recognition and half confusion. He was older than the others, mid-40s, heavy through the jaw, a scar running from his right ear to his collar that had the flat, pale quality of an old wound healed without much care. "Who's—" "She's with us," Briggs said, which was a compression of a longer answer but served the immediate purpose. Sevik accepted it. Combat context made people efficient about trust. You either evaluated quickly or you didn't function. Nora looked around the bay. She was doing triage the way she always did, which was not on the patients in front of her but on the situation itself. Resources, vulnerabilities, timing. They had 4 people including herself. 2 of them operationally trained, one with a sutured forearm and reduced grip strength on the right side, one with a head laceration of unknown depth. They had 1 incapacitated patient who could not be moved without risk to his surgical repair. They had a main door being stacked by at least 3 people, and a floor below that had an unknown threat element and a communications blackout. What they had on the other side of the ledger: her, this room, and the building she'd spent 11 weeks memorizing. "Is there a staff phone in here?" she asked. Mora pointed to the wall panel near the window. She went to it. The internal hospital phone network ran on a separate circuit from the main power. She'd noticed this during her orientation, had filed it away as one of those structural details that seemed administrative until it wasn't. She picked up the handset and got a dial tone. Not dead. The network was up. She dialed the charge desk. Pauline picked up on the second ring with a voice that was strained in the way voices got when you were managing a building-wide emergency with insufficient information. "Trauma wing charge, who—" "Pauline, it's Valdez." A brief silence. "Where are you? We have fire alarm, power failure, and I've got 2 patients in the corridors who... Listen to me carefully. The alarm is not a fire. There are armed individuals on this floor and the floor below. I need you to initiate a Code Silver lockdown right now, and I need you to call building security and tell them to hold every external entrance until law enforcement arrives. Do not send any staff toward the trauma bays. Do you understand? The silence on the other end was longer this time. Nora could hear Pauline processing, the push and pull of a person who was experienced enough to take a serious warning seriously and cautious enough not to want to act on incomplete information. Armed, Pauline said. Yes. You're sure? I'm sure. Another pause. Code Silver requires attending authorization or security supervisor confirmation. I can't just... Pauline. Nora kept her voice flat and even. I am telling you there are armed men on this floor. I am asking you to make a phone call. You don't need authorization to make a phone call. A beat. Then, I'll call security, and I'm calling the police. Good. Stay away from the trauma bays. She hung up and turned back to the room. The main door moved. Not much, 3 inches, stopped by the crash cart, but the crash cart shifted and the metal legs scraped the floor in a sound that was both ordinary and, in this context, completely wrong. Sevik was already braced against the door's frame. Mora had repositioned. They're testing it, Briggs said quietly. They know we're in here, Sevik said. They knew before they got to the door. Nora looked at the window. The bay's single window faced the interior of the building. An air shaft, primarily, with a view of the concrete infrastructure between wings. Not an exit. But the air shaft connected to the north stairwell via a maintenance grate on the 3rd floor, which was 1 floor above them, which meant... She stopped. She went back to the wall panel. Not the phone this time. The environmental controls. The bay had independent air handling, again on the medical circuit, and the air shaft that the window faced was part of the hospital's central return system. She opened the panel, found the damper controls, and looked at the configuration for about 4 seconds. What are you doing? Mora asked. The air shaft is connected to the stairwell on 3, she said. If Tanner is on the north stairwell access, and we can open the damper from here, we can create a communication path without exposing anyone to the corridor. Mora looked at her. You can do that? The controls are right here, so that's not... He stopped, started again. That's not a thing people usually know. I read the building schematic during my orientation, she said. It was a slow afternoon. Briggs made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. She opened the damper. The air shaft beyond the window produced a low-pressured whoosh as the air handling shifted. She pushed the window latch and opened it 3 inches. Enough to pass sound, not enough to pass anything else. Tanner? Briggs said toward the gap. Quiet. Direct. North stairwell. Sound off. 10 seconds. Then, faint and distorted by concrete and distance, a voice filtered back through the shaft. Briggs, 2 tangos on 2, moving up. 3 on your floor confirmed. I'm cut off at the stairwell door. Can you hold? For now. Not long. Briggs closed his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. She watched him run the math, the same math she was running. We need to split their attention, he said, opening them again. If all 3 elements converge on this bay before law enforcement arrives, then we're in a defended position with a surgical patient and no exit, Nora finished. Yeah. What are you thinking? She was thinking about the maintenance corridor she'd just walked through, about the supply closet they'd sheltered in, about the floor plan she'd built in her head over 11 weeks of night shifts, the routes she'd mapped without consciously deciding to map them, the habit of knowing terrain that had survived every transition in her life because some habits don't end, they just change context. She was also thinking about Dr. Marcus Hale, which was an intrusive thought she didn't have time for, but it appeared anyway. The image of him dismissing her in that trauma bay, the flat certainty with which he'd redirected her, the way the room had moved with him without question. She thought about how that kind of certainty worked, how it created a gravity field that pulled everything toward the person at the center and made everyone else orbit at a distance, not asking questions, not offering corrections, not doing the thing that needed to be done because the cost of doing it was never worth it until suddenly it was the only thing that mattered. She thought about Calvin Reese's blood pressure dropping in steps and what would have happened if she hadn't spoken. She thought, this is the same problem. Different room, different stakes, same structure. Someone has positioned themselves as the authority, and everyone else is orbiting, and the situation is going to deteriorate until somebody stops performing deference and starts performing function. I need 5 minutes and a distraction, she said. Briggs looked at her. What kind of distraction? Noise, not gunfire, something that sounds like personnel moving on the south end of this floor. If they think we're splitting, they'll reposition to cover the south approach, which gives me a window to access the main corridor from the service passage and reach the secondary stairwell. And then? And then I can get to the building's security hub on the ground floor, which is where the main power cutoff was accessed. Which means whoever did it either is still there or left the panel open, and if it's open, I can restore partial building power and get the security cameras back online. A silence. Mora and Sevik exchanged a look. You want to go back out there, Briggs said. Alone. There are 2 of you, 1 patient and 1 door. You need both of you here. She held his gaze. I need you to trust my read of the building. I trusted your read of the chest bleed, he said. That worked out. Yeah. He was quiet for a moment. It did. He looked at Sevik, something passing between them. Not words, just the compressed communication of people who had spent years learning to understand each other in conditions that didn't allow for extended discussion. Sevik nodded once. 2 minutes of noise on the south end, Briggs said. Starting in 90 seconds. When you have power, call back on the wall phone. Extension 114 is Tanner's position. He'll have a handset near the stairwell. Got it. She was already moving back toward the alcove. Valdez? She stopped, turned. Briggs was looking at her with an expression that was doing several things at once. Assessment, something that might have been concern, and underneath both of those, the specific look of a person who was revising an earlier conclusion about someone they'd underestimated. Don't get killed, he said. I've been told that before, she said. Did you listen? She considered. Most of the time. She pulled the alcove panel shut behind her. The service passage was the same as she'd left it. Dark, narrow, the green safety light at the far end, the smell of old concrete and recycled air. She moved through it at a pace that was faster than careful and slower than reckless, which was the pace she'd learned to maintain when the situation required speed without sacrificing the awareness that kept you alive long enough to be useful. She came out through the supply closet, listened at the door for 3 seconds, then opened it and stepped into the service hallway. The distraction hit right on time. From the south end of the trauma floor, she heard it. A deliberate cascade of metal, equipment falling, a supply cart going over with a crash that was specific and convincing, and would read to anyone tracking movement as someone running, someone displaced, someone creating an alternative problem. Briggs and Sevik had used what they had. She heard the footsteps on the main corridor shift, the rhythm changing, one set breaking off from the bay door approach and moving south, 2 left at the main door. She had her window. She moved to the corridor junction and looked both directions in the 2-second exposure she could afford. The corridor was red-lit and empty in her direction. 40 meters to the south, she could make out the shape of 2 figures who had paused at the bay door. One of them looking toward the south commotion, the other maintaining focus on the door. Good discipline. Bad news for her timeline. She crossed the corridor in 3 seconds, kept to the far wall, and moved north toward the administrative wing. The security hub was 2 turns and 1 staircase away. She'd walked it twice, once during her first week for orientation, once in her 5th week when a cardiac monitor had been flagged for inspection, and she'd carried it down herself because the technician was running late and she'd wanted to see the room. It had been a choice, at the time, that felt like nothing. The kind of small decision that looks like nothing and turns out to be everything. She took the stairs at a run and hit the ground floor moving. The security hub was at the end of a short administrative corridor, behind a door that required a keycard. Nora's badge had floor-level access. She'd checked, during orientation, casually, the way she checked everything. The habit of mapping access so deeply embedded she didn't notice herself doing it anymore. She badged the door. The reader cycled. The light turned green. She pushed inside. The room was small and smelled of electronics and old coffee. Two banks of monitors sat dark on the main console. The cameras had gone down with the primary power. The electrical panel was on the far wall, and it was open. The breakers had been pulled in a deliberate sequence, not random, not exploratory, a specific pattern that targeted the main lighting circuits and the camera feeds while leaving the medical power intact. Someone had planned this. Someone who knew this building, or who had access to someone who did. She scanned the sequence. 7 breakers. She needed 6 of them, not all. She couldn't restore everything without triggering a cascade that would take longer than she had. But she could bring back the cameras and the corridor lighting on the trauma floor, which would give Tanner visibility from his stairwell position and give arriving law enforcement something other than darkness to navigate. She started with the camera circuit. The monitors on the console flickered and came up in stages, 8, 12, 16 feeds, the building reassembling itself in a grid of gray-green video. She could see the south end of the trauma floor, the main corridor, the external approach. She could see a figure at the south stairwell she didn't recognize. She could see the ambulance bay where 2 vehicles were parked at wrong angles, and she could see, at the north end of the property, the sweep of headlights coming through the rain. Multiple vehicles. Moving fast. Law enforcement. She let herself have exactly 1 second of relief, and then she kept working. She restored the trauma floor corridor lighting, 2 breakers, sequential, and heard the hum of the system above her change pitch as the fluorescents came back on 1 floor up. She could imagine what that looked like from the main corridor right now. The red emergency strips replaced by full overhead light, the building suddenly visible again, the positions of every person on that floor exposed. She reached for the phone on the security console and dialed 114. It rang once, twice. Then Tanner's voice. "Who's this?" "Valdez, cameras are up, corridor lighting is up on your floor, law enforcement is at the north property line, maybe 90 seconds out." She paused. "Tell Briggs." A silence. "You're the nurse. Right now, I'm the person who just turned your lights back on." Another silence, shorter. "Understood. Good copy." A beat. "Briggs said to tell you." Cal's pressure spiked. He's asking for it. She closed her eyes for 1 second. Blood pressure spike in a post-surgical patient with a repaired arterial bleed, in a room that had just undergone significant physical stress, with lines and drains still in place. That was a problem. "Tell him I'm coming back," she said. She was already moving for the door when it opened. The figure in the doorway was not law enforcement. He was average height, dressed in the kind of nondescript clothing that people wore when they wanted to move through a building without being remembered, and he had a tablet computer in his left hand that showed the floor plan of Harwick Central Hospital's trauma wing. He looked at her with the specific expression of a person who had expected to find an empty room and was recalculating rapidly. Then he looked at the console behind her, at the camera feeds that were now live, at the breaker panel where 6 of the 7 breakers had been restored. She watched him process what she'd done and decide what to do about her. It was a 3-second window. She'd operated in 3-second windows before. She threw the console chair into his path and came in behind it. He was trained. She registered that in the first half-second, in the way he stepped around the chair and shifted his weight and brought his hands up. But there's a kind of training that happens in controlled environments with known variables and rules about what your opponent will and won't do. And there's a different kind of training that happens over years of making decisions in places where the consequences of being wrong were immediate and non-negotiable. Nora Valdez had the second kind. The fight lasted 11 seconds. It was not clean. She took a hit across the left side of her face that would bruise badly by morning and would hurt worse the day after. She used an elbow and a knee and a wrist lock she'd been taught by a woman who trained Special Forces candidates at a facility she'd never been allowed to name in conversation. And at the end of 11 seconds, the man from the doorway was on the floor of the security hub with his tablet cracked under the console and his right arm at an angle that would require medical attention before anything else. She stood over him, breathing hard. From upstairs, through the ceiling, she heard the corridor lights flicker, and through the ventilation, distantly, the sound of doors being breached, voices shouting in the clipped, commanding tones of law enforcement making entry into a building. 90 seconds, she had said. She'd been off by about 30. Her left cheekbone throbbed. She put her fingers against it briefly. Nothing structural, just tissue. She'd had worse and kept moving. She reached for the console phone and dialed back to 114. It rang 4 times with no answer. She tried the bay desk. Pauline picked up on the first ring. Valdez, is the team in Bay 2 okay? Law enforcement just reached the trauma floor. They've got 2 men in custody in the main corridor, and they're... A pause. She could hear voices in the background, Pauline turning away from the phone. They're at the bay door. Briggs said... Another pause. Longer. Valdez. What? The patient in Bay 2. His drain output just spiked. Briggs is asking... He's asking if you're coming back up right now or if he needs to move Calvin to OR. Nora was already at the security hub door. Tell him don't move, she said. Tell him do not touch the drains and do not move Calvin Reese. Tell him I'll be there in 90 seconds. She ran. Not the controlled fast movement she'd been using all night. Full run, shoes hitting the stairwell floor in a rhythm that was nothing but forward momentum, and the awareness that a blood drain spiking in a post-surgical arterial repair patient meant one specific thing, and that thing had a window that was measured in minutes. She hit the trauma floor at a dead sprint. The corridor was full of law enforcement now. She registered badges and vests and the specific controlled tension of a sweep still in progress, and she ran through them saying, "Nurse, patient emergency, Bay 2," and nobody stopped her because she was wearing scrubs and moving like she knew where she was going. She hit the bay door. Briggs opened it from inside before she touched it. She went straight to the bedside. The portable monitor was showing the number she didn't want to see. The drain output had doubled in 7 minutes, and Calvin Reese's blood pressure, which had stabilized at 88, had dropped back to 79 and was still moving. The repair was bleeding again. She looked at the drain, looked at the line, looked at the incision and the packing. Hale had closed him for the immediate threat, but the repair itself was fragile, and the hours of physical stress in this room had done something to the margins. She needed a surgeon. She needed Hale. She turned to Briggs. "Where's Dr. Hale?" He looked at her. Something moved across his face. He was in the corridor when the alarm went. Security moved the non-essential, "Find him." She was already pulling supplies. "I can stabilize the output for maybe 20 minutes. After that, Cal needs the OR, and he needs a surgeon who can go back in without starting over." On it, Briggs was already at the door. She leaned over the patient and worked, her hands moving through a sequence she knew the way she knew her own heartbeat, the specific competence of someone who had learned things under conditions that didn't allow forgetting. Behind her, she heard the door open again. She heard footsteps, and then a voice she recognized. Dr. Marcus Hale, breathing harder than usual, carrying what might have been fear or adrenaline or both, standing at the door of the bay where he'd told her she didn't belong. "Valdez," he said. She didn't look up. "Get gloves on. Cal's repair is compromised, and we need to stabilize his output before we move him upstairs." A pause. "What do you need?" he asked. And something in the way he said it, the absence, for the first time, of the particular weight he usually put on the word nurse, made her glance over her shoulder for just a moment. He was already pulling on gloves. She turned back to the patient and told him exactly what she needed, and for the next 18 minutes they worked side by side in a silence that held underneath it the wreckage of every assumption Marcus Hale had walked into this building carrying, and the beginning of something neither of them had words for yet. Calvin Reese went to the OR at 4:22 in the morning. Hale walked alongside the transport gurney the entire way, one hand resting near the drain line without touching it, his eyes on the monitor readout that a respiratory tech was holding at shoulder height, so the number stayed visible through every turn. He didn't speak much during the transport. Neither did Nora. There wasn't anything to say that the situation hadn't already said for them, and the corridor was busy enough with law enforcement and hospital security and the overnight staff who had come out of their lockdown positions that conversation would have been noise anyway. She held the elevator door. He guided the gurney in. They rode up in silence. In the OR anteroom, the surgical team took over. A different attending, a vascular specialist named Dr. Priya Okafor, who had been called in from home and arrived still pulling her hair back, and 2 residents who looked like they'd been awake for 30 hours already and were running on the specific fuel source that came from understanding that the alternative to staying sharp was someone dying on a table. Hale gave the handoff report in 3 minutes, clean and specific, and when he mentioned Nora's stabilization work on the drain, he said her name without qualification, Not the nurse, not my team, just Valdez. Stabilize the output. Here are the numbers. It was a small thing. She noticed it anyway. The OR doors closed behind the gurney, and the anteroom was suddenly quiet, and the way rooms got quiet when the immediate emergency had passed, and everything left over was paperwork and aftermath. Hale stood facing the door for a moment. His shoulders dropped about half an inch. The specific release of a man letting go of something he'd been carrying without acknowledging the weight. Then he turned around. "How's your face?" he asked. She'd almost forgotten about the bruise. The left side of her cheekbone had been throbbing at a low, consistent level for the last 40 minutes, working its way from sharp to dull, which meant the swelling was setting in. She reached up and pressed the area lightly. Still nothing structural. It would look worse tomorrow than it felt tonight. "It's fine," she said. He looked at it with the specific attention of a physician cataloging injury, not the generic attention of someone expressing concern. "You should get imaging." "I will. Later." A pause. He was clearly working through something, running an internal calculation that was taking longer than his external calculations usually did. She watched him and didn't help. "I owe you an apology," he said. The words came out in a specific order and at a specific pace that suggested they had been arranged deliberately. Not spontaneous, but not insincere. He'd decided to say this, and he was saying it. "You owe the patient a better outcome than he almost got," she said. "You can start there." He looked at her for a moment. "That's fair?" "I know." Another pause. Not hostile, more like two people standing at the edge of a conversation that was going to require more time and fewer adrenaline metabolites in their bloodstreams than either of them currently had. She was tired in a way that had settled into her bones, the specific exhaustion that came after sustained operational stress, when the body started sending invoices for everything it had deferred. "I want to understand," he said, "who I've been speaking to for the last 11 weeks. She was quiet for a moment. "Does it change anything that happened in the last 6 hours?" "No, but it changes how I think about the last 11 weeks. Which was, she had to admit, a more honest answer than she'd expected. "That conversation will keep," she said. "Right now I need to check on my patients, and then I need to file an incident report before whatever law enforcement is running this investigation decides to talk to me without a copy in front of me." He nodded, not dismissed, just accepting the timeline. "Valdez." She stopped. "The OR report will reflect your clinical intervention accurately. All of it." She looked at him for one moment. "Thank you," she said, and meant it, and moved on. The sun came up over Harwick City at 6:18, which Nora knew because she was sitting in a plastic chair in the third-floor family consultation room, filling out her third incident form, when the light changed in the window from black to gray, to the particular flat gold of an early morning that had not yet decided what kind of day it intended to be. She had given 2 preliminary statements already, one to the building security supervisor, one to the first law enforcement officer who'd reached the trauma floor. Both had been brief and factual. The longer version was coming. She could feel it the way you felt incoming weather, as a pressure change in the general atmosphere, and she wanted her paperwork in order before it arrived. Briggs appeared in the doorway at 6:31 with 2 cups of coffee from the vending machine down the hall. He set one on the table next to her forms without asking and dropped into the chair across from her with the heavy, considered movement of a man whose body was sending him increasingly insistent messages about the last 12 hours. "Cal's in recovery," he said. "I know. I called the OR desk 20 minutes ago." Okafor said the repair held. She went in, found the bleed point, closed it. "He'll be in the ICU for at least 4 days, but..." He stopped. "He'll be okay." She picked up the coffee. It was terrible. The kind of vending machine coffee that existed purely as a caffeine delivery mechanism with no pretense at flavor. And she drank half of it in the first pull. "The men they took into custody," she said. 3 on the trauma floor, 1 in the basement." He held his cup without drinking. "One that wasn't in custody when law enforcement arrived." He looked at her. "Security hub. He needed medical attention before he could be processed," she said. "His arm." "His arm," Briggs said. "Radial fracture, probably. He'll need imaging to confirm." A pause. "Law enforcement is going to want to talk to you about that." I know. The way they're going to characterize it, I know how they're going to characterize it, Briggs. I've sat across from investigators before. She set down the cup. I'm not worried about a review. I'm worried about my incident report being accurate before that conversation starts. He studied her. There was something in his expression that had been developing since the anteroom, a quality of attention that was different from the operational assessment he'd been running all night. More deliberate, less immediate. How long have you been sitting on all of this? He asked. She didn't pretend not to understand the question. 7 months. In this hospital. Specifically, in this city for a year. He absorbed that. Why Harwick? It needed good trauma nurses. She said it without irony, and it was true, and it was also not the whole answer, and from his expression she suspected he understood both of those things. The 75th doesn't just let people walk, he said. No, it doesn't. Medical separation? She looked at him for a long moment. There were things she'd say and things she wouldn't, and the line between them wasn't about clearance or protocol. It was about what she'd decided belonged to her and what she'd decided to leave in the past where it had settled. Honorable discharge, she said. That's the part that's on record. He accepted that. She'd known he would. He was the kind of person who understood that some information was being offered and some was being declined, and that both categories were legitimate. I'm going to need to make some calls this morning, he said. I figured. There are people who are going to want to talk to you who aren't the Harwick PD. She had figured that too. A covert operation compromised at a civilian hospital, an operator in the ICU, 4 individuals in custody who had known the building layout well enough to cut primary power in a specific targeted sequence that didn't stay local. It was already becoming something larger, had probably been something larger before Calvin Reese was ever loaded into an ambulance, and the people who managed those larger things would be making calls by mid-morning if they weren't already. Tell them I'll be available after I sleep, she said. He almost smiled. I'll see what I can do. She went back to her incident form. Tina. The federal investigators arrived at 9:47. There were 3 of them. 2 from an agency whose ID she looked at carefully and set down without comment, and 1 who was technically attached to the agency, but carried himself with the specific affect of someone whose actual institutional home was elsewhere, and who preferred to maintain that ambiguity. His name was Garrett Fossey. He was somewhere in his late 40s, and he sat across from her in the same plastic chair Briggs had occupied 3 hours earlier, and opened a folder that she noted he didn't look at once during the conversation. He was assessing her directly. She returned the favor. You've seen the incident report, she said. It wasn't a question. I've seen both the building security report and your handwritten preliminary. Yes. He had a precise way of speaking. Not clipped, not formal, just specific. The way people spoke when they had learned that imprecise language created problems they then had to spend time untangling. The man in the security hub. His arm. Radial fracture, confirmed by imaging at 7:15. He's been seen by orthopedics. A pause. He's also a person of interest in 2 prior incidents, both of which involved the same operational team that brought your patient in last night. Then you should have a lot to talk to him about. We do. He's not particularly forthcoming yet. Fossey looked at her with the flat, patient attention of someone who was not in a hurry. Your file is interesting, Sergeant Valdez. It's just Valdez. I'm not active. It was Sergeant First Class, the 75th, attached to JSOC between 2017 and 2022. Specialized trauma operator, cross-trained in field surgery with a secondary and tactical site security. He paused. That's a narrow combination. It was a specific role. It was a role that doesn't exist in most unit structures. Another pause. You were attached to a team operating in the same geographic corridor as last night's incident for approximately 18 months. She kept her expression level. She'd known this was coming. Not in the specifics, but in the general shape of it, the way the night's events were going to connect to things that predated them by years. The way certain histories had a gravity that pulled the present back toward them, no matter how much distance you tried to build. You're telling me, she said carefully, that last night wasn't random. I'm not telling you that yet. I'm asking you to tell me what you observed. So she told him. All of it. The entry angle on the injury, the floor plan knowledge evident in the power cut, the tablet she'd seen in the security hub, the language she'd heard through the wall in the service passage. She gave it to him in the same flat, sequential way she'd been trained to give operational reports, without editorializing, without connecting dots she hadn't personally observed. She'd give him the information. He could build his own picture. He listened without writing anything down. At the end, he was quiet for a moment. The tablet in the security hub. The floor plan you saw. Trauma wing, 3rd floor. I only saw it for about 2 seconds. Did you see any annotations? She thought back. The tablet screen in the moment of entry, the brief exposure before the chair and everything after. Bay 2 was marked. There was a secondary marking on the north stairwell access. I couldn't read the text on the secondary. Fossey nodded slowly. That's consistent with what the building security footage shows. Before you restored power, they'd been in the hub for approximately 4 minutes, long enough to confirm positions and update the floor plan. They had inside information, she said. Yes. That's not a small problem. No, he agreed. It's not. He looked at her directly. We're going to need to understand how they got the building information they had. The level of detail in that floor plan, the non-public service corridors, the power panel configuration, that's not available from public records or building permits. She let that land. Let the implication of it run to its natural conclusion without saying it out loud. Someone had given them that information. Someone who knew the building. Someone who had access to the kind of infrastructure details that didn't appear in public documents. I've been here 11 weeks, she said. I know. Fossey looked at her. I'm not suggesting you. I'm telling you the shape of the problem because I think you're going to be involved in solving it, whether you want to be or not. She sat with that for a moment. The coffee from earlier had worn off, and her left cheekbone was back to making itself known with the patient persistence of an injury that intended to be taken seriously over the next several days. She was tired in the way that went beyond sleep deficit, the cumulative tiredness of someone who had been maintaining a low-level operational alertness for months without anyone to acknowledge it. What do you need from me right now? She asked. Right now, nothing. I have what I need for the initial report. He closed the folder he hadn't opened. But I'll be back. I assumed. He stood, paused at the door. The team. Briggs's team. They've been debriefed. Briggs specifically asked that we clarify something for the record. He looked back at her. He wanted it noted formally that last night's outcome, both clinically and operationally, was the direct result of your judgment and your actions. She didn't say anything. He was fairly insistent about that, Fossey said. Briggs tends to be insistent, she said. It's a personality trait. Something close to amusement moved through Fossey's face and didn't complete. He left. The hallway outside the consultation room was louder than it had been at dawn. The hospital's daytime rhythm reasserting itself, the morning shift incoming, staff navigating around the law enforcement presence that was still managing the floor. Nora stood in the doorway for a moment and watched it. Deja was at the nursing station 8 feet away, charting from the night's events. She saw Nora and looked at her with an expression that was doing more than one thing. The relief of someone who'd watched a colleague walk into danger and come back, the complicated guilt of someone who hadn't stepped forward when it mattered earlier in the night, and underneath both of those, something that looked like the beginning of a question she didn't know how to ask. You should get imaging, Deja said, nodding at Nora's face. Hale already said that. When'd you talk to Hale? After the OR. Deja set down her pen. He came to find you? He was in the anteroom. Hale was... She stopped, recalibrated. What did he say? He said I owe you an apology. Nora said it plainly. More or less. Deja stared at her for 3 full seconds. He said that. Something like it. Marcus Hale said something like I owe you an apology. He's going to be different going forward, Nora said. Or he's not. Either way, it's not my primary concern right now. She picked up a chart from the station counter, the overnight board, the patients who needed the morning checks that were already running 20 minutes behind because of the night's events. I'm finishing my shift. Valdez, Your shift was over 3 hours ago. There are patients. Deja looked at her for another moment. Then she picked up her pen. I'll take the South Bays. I've got north. Yeah. A pause. I know. Nora started north. She was halfway down the corridor when Pauline fell into step beside her, appearing from the direction of the administrator's office, with the particular expression of someone carrying news that hadn't fully resolved into good or bad yet. The board has been notified, Pauline said, about last night, the full sequence. Okay? Fraser is coming in. Dr. Edmund Fraser, the hospital's chief of staff, the person above Hale in the institutional hierarchy, a man Nora had encountered twice in 11 weeks, and both times had found to be the specific kind of administrator who is good at managing optics and less good at managing substance. He wants a meeting, today. You, me, Hale, and department leadership. What time? 2:00. She thought about the federal investigators, the incident reports, the imaging she hadn't gotten yet, and the fact that she'd been awake for approximately 26 hours. I'll be there. Pauline was quiet for a moment. They were walking at the same pace, side by side, the way people walked when they were having a conversation they hadn't figured out how to start yet. I've been in this hospital for 14 years, Pauline said finally. I know. I've seen a lot of people come through this department. A pause. I've never seen anyone do what you did last night. I had the advantage of knowing the building. That's not what I mean, and you know it. Pauline stopped walking. Nora stopped with her. The charge nurse looked at her with the direct, unornamented attention of someone who had spent years learning to read people quickly and accurately. Who are you? It was the same question Briggs had asked, in a different register. The answer was the same length and just as complicated. I'm the night shift trauma nurse, Nora said. I'll be at the 2:00 meeting. Pauline looked at her for a moment longer, then nodded once, accepting the deflection without endorsing it, which was its own kind of answer. The North Bay corridor opened up ahead of them, and Nora walked into it the way she'd walked into every shift for 11 weeks. Quietly, efficiently, the minimum amount of noise for the maximum amount of work. She picked up the first chart. She checked the first line. She did the job. The bruise on her face throbbed. She worked around it. She was doing a dressing change in Bay 6 at 11:14 when her phone buzzed. She ignored it. It buzzed again. She finished the dressing, secured the tape, and checked it on her way out of the bay. One text from a number she didn't recognize. 7 words. We need to talk. Not for the report. She stopped in the corridor, looked at the number again. Area code she knew. It was a Federal Exchange, but not the same agency Fossey had come from. Different. She ran the prefix in her head, placed it in 2 seconds. Joint Special Operations Command. She stood in the corridor of Harwick Central Hospital with the phone in her hand and the morning sun coming through the windows at the end of the hall and the sound of the hospital doing its ordinary, complicated work all around her. And she understood, with the specific clarity of someone who had spent years learning to read situations before they fully revealed themselves, that what had happened last night was not a closed event. It was an opening. She typed back, when? The response came in 11 seconds. Already here, parking structure, level 2, blue sedan, alone. She looked up from her phone at the window at the end of the hall. Through the glass, she could see the top level of the parking structure across the drive. From this angle, she couldn't see level 2. She thought about Fossey's words, the level of detail in that floor plan. That's not available from public records. She thought about the inside information, about someone who knew the building. She thought about 11 weeks of being invisible, and about the person who had tracked her to this specific hospital in this specific city and was sitting in a car in the parking structure at 11:16 in the morning, waiting for her to come down. She thought about how nobody accidentally found Harwick Central. Her shift ended in 3 hours. She had a 2:00 meeting. She had a federal investigator who had told her he'd be back. She typed, "Give me 20 minutes." She pocketed the phone, walked back to the nursing station, and updated her patient board with the specific calm of someone who was managing 2 separate situations and intended to manage both of them correctly. Deja was at the station. "Everything okay?" "Fine," Nora said. "I need to step out briefly around 11:30. Can you cover north?" "Sure." A pause. Where are you going? Nora picked up the next chart. Parking structure, she said. And Deja looked at her face. The bruise, the 26 hours behind the eyes, the quality of attention that had been running at a specific elevated frequency all night and had not yet come down. And said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say to a person who had already made their decision. At 11:28, Nora walked out of the hospital's side entrance, crossed the service drive, and entered the parking structure. Level 1 was half full. Daytime shift vehicles, a few visitor cars, the usual. She took the ramp to level 2. The blue sedan was parked in the second row from the far wall. She approached from a diagonal, not from directly behind, and she checked the sight lines on all 4 sides before she came within 10 feet of it. Old habit. She wasn't going to stop having it. The driver's side window came down. The person behind the wheel was a woman, mid-50s, silver hair cut short and practical, wearing a jacket that probably cost 4 times what it looked like it cost. She had the kind of face that didn't give you much. Not cold exactly, but trained to neutrality in the specific way that people train themselves when their work required it. She looked at Nora with the direct assessment of someone who had been waiting with patience but not with ease. "Sergeant Valdez," she said. "I'm not active," Nora said. "I know." She didn't offer a name. "Get in." Nora looked at her for a moment. The morning light in the parking structure was fluorescent and flat, making everything look slightly unreal. The woman in the car and the cars around them, and the ordinary concrete world of a hospital parking structure that had, in the last 11 hours, stopped being ordinary. She opened the passenger door and got in. The woman reached into the back seat and produced a file. A physical file, actual paper, which told Nora something about the level of the conversation before a word of it had been spoken. She set it on the dashboard without opening it. "Last night wasn't an isolated incident," the woman said. "I know. The people who track Calvin Reese's unit to this hospital have been active across 4 locations in the last 6 months. 3 of those incidents resulted in casualties. This one didn't." She looked at Nora directly. "Because of you." Nora looked at the file on the dashboard. She didn't touch it yet. "You knew about this hospital before last night," she said. "Yes. You knew I was here." A pause. Fractional. "Yes." "How long?" "Since month 2. She absorbed that. 2 months. Someone had known she was here since her second month, had watched her go through the motions of starting over, had not intervened or made contact, had let her build her 11 weeks of ordinary night shifts and invisible competence, and had waited for whatever they'd been waiting for. "You let it get to last night," she said. The edge in her voice was controlled, but it was there, and she didn't try to remove it. "Last night was not the intended outcome," the woman said. "The team's location was compromised through a channel we identified too late. We couldn't reach Briggs before they were already moving." A pause. "We also couldn't reach you. You'd made it clear when you left that you weren't to be contacted. I made it clear because I was done." "I know. I'm still done." The woman was quiet for a moment. She had the patience of someone who had run these conversations before, who knew that some things needed to be said before the actual conversation could start, and who was willing to wait for the saying to be finished. "We have a problem," she said. "The inside source, the one who provided the building layout." Nora waited. "It's not resolved. The 4 people in custody are operational level. They were given the information. They didn't originate it." She reached over and opened the file on the dashboard, a single photograph on top. She angled it toward Nora. "We believe the source is currently in this building." Nora looked at the photograph. The hospital ID badge in the photo was for Harwick Central. The face above it was someone she recognized. The air in the car changed. Not dramatically, not with any of the external markers that people associated with shock. Just a small internal shift, the precise recalibration of someone absorbing information that reorganized everything that came before it. "How long?" Nora said. "We've had suspicion for 3 weeks. Confirmation as of this morning." 3 weeks. The person in that photograph had been inside this building for 3 weeks while this had been developing, while the intelligence about the building's layout had been assembled and transferred and used, while Calvin Reese had been bled out on an ambulance stretcher and carried through the doors that person had been walking through every shift. Does Fossey know? Fossey has the photograph. He doesn't yet know the level of access. The woman looked at her steadily. You do. You know this building. You know the access points, the schedules, the routes. You know who has keys to what and which corridors they use. I'm a nurse, Nora said. 11 weeks. You're the person who mapped this building in 11 weeks because you couldn't turn off the part of you that maps buildings. The woman held her gaze. And right now, that makes you the most valuable person in it. Nora sat with the photograph in her hand and the file on the dashboard, and the parking structure's fluorescent light making the whole world look flat and slightly unreal. And she thought about the 2 o'clock meeting and the patients in the North Bays and the bruise on her face and the 26 hours she'd been running on no sleep. And she thought about the person in the photograph walking into this building on day shift in 47 minutes. I need something from you first, she said. Name it. Everything. The full file. Not the edited version, not the version that protects the chain. Everything you have, starting from when you first identified me and ending with this morning. The woman didn't hesitate. Done. And when this is over, Nora said, I'm done. Permanently. No more waiting, no more watching, no more letting it play out to see what I do. Done. A pause that was 1 second longer than the others. Agreed, the woman said. Nora looked at the photograph one more time. Then she took out her phone and called Fossey. He picked up on the second ring. Valdez. I have something, she said. But I need you to move right now before the noon shift change, because if we miss this window, where are you? Parking structure, level 2. She glanced at the woman beside her. And I need you to come alone. Calvin Reese went to the OR at 4:22 in the morning. Hale walked alongside the transport gurney the entire way, one hand near the drain line without touching it, his eyes on the portable monitor a respiratory tech held at shoulder height. He didn't speak during the transport. Neither did Nora. The corridor was busy enough with law enforcement and hospital security that conversation would have been noise anyway. She held the elevator. He guided the gurney in. They rode up in silence. In the OR anteroom, the surgical team took over. Dr. Priya Okafor, a vascular specialist, called in from home, still pulling her hair back when she arrived, and 2 residents running on the specific fuel that came from understanding the alternative to staying sharp. Hale gave the handoff in 3 minutes, clean and specific, and when he mentioned Nora's stabilization work on the drain, he used her name without qualifier. Not the nurse. Not my team, which had just Valdez. Stabilize the output, here are the numbers. It was a small thing. She noticed it anyway. The OR doors closed and the anteroom went quiet in the way rooms did when the immediate emergency had passed, and what remained was paperwork and aftermath. Hale stood facing the doors for a moment. His shoulders dropped half an inch. The release of a man setting down something he'd been carrying without admitting the weight. Then he turned around. How's your face? He asked. She'd almost forgotten about the bruise. It had been throbbing at a low, consistent level for 40 minutes, working from sharp to dull, which meant the swelling was setting in. She pressed it lightly. Nothing structural. It would look worse tomorrow than it felt tonight. Fine, she said. He looked at it with clinical attention. You should get imaging. Later. A pause. He was working through something, the internal calculation taking longer than his external ones usually did. She watched him and didn't help. I owe you an apology, he said. The words came out deliberately, arranged in advance, not spontaneous, but not insincere either. You owe the patient a better outcome than he almost got, she said. Start there. He looked at her for a moment. That's fair. I know. The corridor beyond the anteroom was filling with morning shift movement. Neither of them had slept. The space between them held the wreckage of 11 weeks of assumptions and the rawer wreckage of the last few hours, and there wasn't enough time or enough oxygen left in either of them to do anything useful with it right now. The OR report will reflect your clinical intervention accurately, he said. All of it. She looked at him for one moment. Thank you, she said, and meant it, and moved on. What's a muspum? The sun came up over Harwick City at 6:18. Nora knew because she was in the family consultation room on 3, filling out her 3rd incident form. when the light in the window shifted from black to gray to the flat gold of a morning that hadn't yet decided what it intended to be. Briggs appeared in the doorway at 6:31 with 2 vending machine coffees. He set one beside her forms and dropped into the chair across from her, with the heavy movement of a man whose body had been sending him increasingly insistent messages for hours. "Cal's in recovery," he said. "I called the OR desk 20 minutes ago. Okafor said the repair held ICU for at least 4 days, but..." He stopped. "He's okay." She drank half the coffee in one pull. It was terrible. She finished it anyway. "The men in custody," she said. 3 on the trauma floor, 1 from the basement. He held his cup without drinking. 1 who wasn't in custody when law enforcement arrived. His arm needed attention before processing. "His arm," Briggs said. "Radial fracture, probably. He needs imaging." A pause. "Law enforcement will want to talk to you about that." "I know. That's why I'm finishing my incident report before they do." She kept writing. "How'd you know, in the elevator, that I was Army?" He looked at her. "The way you moved through the building, the way you placed yourself in the bay, the way you held your position when Hale pushed back." He paused. "People with that combination either have a background or they've spent years wishing they did. You weren't wishing." She didn't respond to that. She wrote another line. 75th, he said, detached to JSOC. "Before," she said. Just that. He accepted it. He was the kind of person who understood that some information was being offered and some declined, and both categories were legitimate. "I'm making calls this morning. There are people who will want to talk to you who aren't Harwick PD. Tell them after I sleep." He almost smiled. "I'll see what I can do." The federal investigators arrived at 9:47. 3 of them. 2 from an agency whose ID she read carefully and set down. The third was a man named Garrett Fossey, mid-40s, precise speech, a folder he never looked at. He sat across from her in the plastic chair Briggs had used 3 hours earlier and assessed her the way she assessed him, directly and without pretense. "The man in the security hub," he said. "Radial fracture," she said, "confirmed by imaging at 7:15. He's a person of interest in 2 prior incidents involving the same operational team as last night." "Then you have a lot to ask him." "We do. He's not forthcoming." Fossey opened the folder he hadn't looked at and slid a photograph across the table. "We believe the source of the building intelligence is currently inside this hospital." She looked at the photograph. The hospital ID badge, the face above it. Someone she recognized, not well, not personally, but with the specific familiarity of people who occupied the same building and moved through its rhythms on overlapping schedules. She sat with it for a moment. The air in the room didn't change. She didn't let it. "How long?" she said. "Suspicion for 3 weeks. Confirmation this morning." 3 weeks. The person in that photograph had been walking these corridors for 3 weeks while the building intelligence was assembled and transferred, while the operational sequence was built that put Calvin Reese on a surgical table overnight. "What do you need from me?" she said. "I need someone who knows this building, not the floor plan. The patterns, schedules, access habits, which corridors people use at which times." He looked at her steadily. "Your agents have been here 6 hours. You've been here 11 weeks. She looked at the photograph again and ran the night backward in her head, not emotionally but systematically, the way she'd been trained to reconstruct events. The alarm, the corridors, every face she'd passed in the red-edged emergency lighting, logged without knowing she was logging them. She found what she was looking for. "North corridor," she said. "About 2 minutes after the power cut. They should have been moving to their emergency position. Every staff member has a Code Silver assignment." They weren't. They were standing, still, in a position with direct sightline to the bay, 2 entrance. Fossey was very still. "I filed it as composure," she said. "I'm refiling it now." "Observation post," he said, waiting to confirm whether the approach succeeded. He closed the folder. "I need you inside. If they move before we can position, I need someone who knows which doors they'll try." She checked the time. Their shift check-in was for a biomedical equipment audit, sub-level storage. That's accessed by one elevator or the south stairwell. She looked at him. If they're going to move, it's before noon shift change. Maximum personnel flux, 20-minute gap before anyone notices an absence. He checked his watch. That's less than 20 minutes. 17, she said, no radio. If they're monitoring hospital frequencies, understood. He stood. Move now? She was already at the door. She went back in through the side entrance and straight to the nursing station. Deja looked up. That was more than 20 minutes. I know. Check the staff schedule for me. She pulled out her phone, showed the photograph. Current location for this person. Don't use the PA. Don't call their extension, just the board. Deja looked at the photograph, then at Nora, then back. I know who it is. A beat. Deja turned to the physical scheduling board on the wall. Magnetic tags on a grid. The analog backup nobody had updated to reflect the morning's disruption. Biomedical storage, she said quietly. Sublevel. Equipment audit. Signed in this morning. How long ago? 40 minutes. Nora was already moving. The sublevel had its own lighting circuit, unaffected by last night's power cut. The corridor ran clean and fluorescent and empty ahead of her. Biomedical storage was at the far end, its door ajar. Through the gap she could hear someone working. The focused, efficient sound of a task being completed against a timeline. She approached along the wall. Through the door, shelving units, equipment in ordered rows, and at the far end a figure at the secondary server access panel. Panel open. Tablet in hand, cable connected. Working quickly and quietly with the composure of someone who knew exactly how long they had. Data exfiltration, patient records, access logs, internal communications. The operational intelligence package that turned a failed tactical strike into a partial strategic success. What the team couldn't extract in person, someone inside was extracting digitally. She stepped back from the door and texted Fossey. Sublevel biomedical, data exfiltration in progress. I need 2 minutes before you move. His response came in 10 seconds. Why 2 minutes? She typed, I need them to finish. The pause from his end had a texture to it. Then 90 seconds, no more. She stood in the corridor and counted. Every byte of copied data was a documented act. Every second of transmission was evidence with a timestamp. Defense attorneys were good at creating ambiguity around intent. They were less good at creating ambiguity around a completed action on a server log. She'd learned that from a JAG officer during her 3rd deployment and had never expected to use it in a hospital basement. At 91 seconds, the stairwell door opened behind her, Fossey and 2 others. She stepped aside. They went through the biomedical storage door, and the figure at the server panel turned. The expression on their face was not surprise. It was the collapse of someone who had been running a long calculation and reached the end of it and found the wrong answer. The tablet was still in their hand. The cable was still connected. The copy was 60% complete. Fossey told her that later, which meant the record of exactly what they'd been trying to take was sitting on the server with a timestamp and an active connection log. Fossey said their name. They said nothing. Neil Caro, Biomedical Systems Technician, 2 years and 3 months at Harwick Central. No prior record, good performance reviews, and, as Fossey explained afterward in the corridor while his people managed the room, a flag in a financial investigation 6 months ago for deposits that didn't match his salary, lost in administrative backlog until a routine audit 3 weeks ago resurfaced his name. 2 years and 3 months to map the building. To become the person who serviced the equipment, maintained the servers, walked the non-public corridors with a service cart until he knew them better than the people who designed them. To photograph access panels and document power configurations, and assemble an infrastructure schematic from pieces that were each innocuous on their own. He'd told himself it was an intelligence operation, information retrieval. He hadn't known anyone was going to get hurt. Nora listened to Fossey tell her this and felt the specific, complicated tiredness of someone processing an explanation that was complete and somehow still insufficient. The tablet, she said. Still connected when we came in. 60% complete. We have a full record of the attempted transfer. He paused. And we have what he'd already sent over the past 3 weeks. Charged? 3 federal statutes, DA's office reviewing state charges, full indictment within the week. He looked at her. It won't be quiet. His employment, his role, the hospital as the site, all of it named in the charging documents. She went back to her paperwork. Good, she said. Bam. The 2 o'clock meeting was in the executive conference room on 4, which Nora had never been in before. It had a view of the freight rail yard and a long table arranged to imply authority, which it then used for something more complicated. Fraser at the head. Hale and Pauline along one side. 2 board members. Fossey in the back corner, not at the table. A hospital attorney who hadn't put her briefcase down since she arrived. Nora sat midway down and kept her legal pad in front of her. Fraser opened with the incident summary. The breach, the clinical sequence, the law enforcement response, Calvin Reese's current status. He was precise and careful with sequencing, which was what administrators did when they understood that the order of information shaped its reception. Then he turned to Hale. The clinical sequence in Bay 2, on the record. Hale looked up from his legal pad, where he'd been focusing on a middle distance that was somewhere inside his own recalibration. Patient presented with penetrating thoracic trauma, active hemorrhage, deteriorating vitals, he said. I initiated standard protocol. During assessment, Nurse Valdez identified a vascular component I initially assessed differently. A pause audible in the room. Her assessment was correct. I adjusted course. The patient survived. Fraser looked at him. You adjusted course. Based on her clinical read, Hale said, which was accurate. The attorney wrote something. A board member shifted. Nurse Valdez, Fraser said. The board understands you have relevant experience beyond your nursing qualifications. I served 7 years in the U.S. Army in roles combining trauma medicine with special operations support, she said. I left active service and transitioned to civilian nursing. That's the outline. The specifics are restricted, he said. Yes. He looked at her for a moment, doing the administrative calculus. Liability, narrative, institutional positioning. She watched him work and waited. Last night, he said, this hospital was compromised through an internal failure we're still assessing. A patient's life was at risk. Staff were placed in danger. The outcome was significantly better than it could have been. He looked between her and Hale. Because of decisions made in this room, and decisions made in sequence, which I want on the record. He turned to the board members. We'll be reviewing clinical protocol for expert consultation during trauma events. We'll be reviewing escalation procedures for situations where nursing staff identify concerns that differ from attending assessment. Careful language, administrative language, but underneath it, a legible fact. These reviews are overdue. Hale said nothing. His jaw moved slightly. Additionally, Fraser said, the board has approved a new position, Senior Clinical Specialist, Trauma Operations. It sits above charge nurse level, below attending, with authority to flag and escalate clinical concerns through a direct board channel, independent of department hierarchy. He looked at Nora. We'd like to discuss that role with you formally, this week. Pauline caught Nora's eye from across the table. The 14-year charge nurse's expression was doing several things at once. Not triumph, not vindication, something more honest than either. The look of a person watching a situation resolve in a way that was right, and also too slow, and not knowing exactly how to hold both of those things. Nora gave her a small nod. The meeting ran another 35 minutes. When it ended, Fraser stopped beside her at the door. I'm sorry, he said, for the environment that made last night harder than it needed to be. She looked at him. Fix the environment. The apology isn't the part that matters. He held her gaze, then nodded and left. Hale was last. He stopped in the corridor outside, and she slowed without fully stopping. The new position, he said. What about it? You should take it. He looked at the wall, then at her. I know that's not something you need from me. I heard you. He was working at something. She could see it in the specific effort his face was making to carry a thought that was uncomfortable to carry. 23 years, he said. I've been doing this 23 years. I've heard nurses push back. I've always found a reason why the reason I didn't listen was something other than what it was. She waited. It was what it was, he said. She looked at him for a moment. The bruise throbbed. She was tired in a way one night's sleep wasn't going to address. I know, she said. Now we move forward. He nodded. She walked down the corridor and didn't look back. At 4:15, Fossey found her at the nursing station finishing the paperwork the day had kept interrupting. He set a single sheet beside her forms. She read it without picking it up. Caro's initial statement, he said. Releasable portions. Dense formal language over a 2-year timeline. Data pulled on 12 separate occasions. The infrastructure schematic assembled in pieces over months, each piece innocuous on its own. An operation built from the inside out, by a man who had told himself he wasn't doing what he was doing until the night he watched it fail from a corridor near Bay 2. He's charged, she said. 3 federal statutes, state charges pending, indictment within the week, his name, his role, this hospital, all of it public in the charging documents. She went back to her forms. Good. Fossey didn't leave immediately. She could feel him at the edge of her peripheral vision, working up to something. The woman from this morning, he said. She kept writing. She's gone. I know you know that. A pause. She's going to want to stay in contact with you. She knows my position. She tends to find positions like that negotiable. Nora set down her pen, looked at him. We have an agreement. It's documented and it's verbal, and she's the kind of person who maintains both. She picked up her pen. You can tell her I said that. He looked at her for a moment with the regard of a person who had spent a full day revising their assessment of someone and found the revision significant. I'll pass it along, he said, and left. Deja appeared 30 seconds later with 2 cups of coffee from the break room pot, actual coffee, and set one down without asking. Caro, she said. Yes. I processed a biomedical work order for him 6 weeks ago. He was in the server room 45 minutes, and I didn't think anything of it. You wouldn't have. He was doing his job. The job just had a different objective than what was on the paperwork. Deja sat with her cup in both hands. Are you taking the position? I don't know yet. What's to think about? Whether I want to stay. Deja absorbed that. Do you? Nora looked down the trauma wing corridor, the movement, the urgency managed into routine, the constant low-level problem-solving that never resolved because there was always another patient, another shift, another night. 11 weeks of trying to be unremarkable, followed by 18 hours of being the opposite. She was going to have to work out what those 2 things meant together, and that work was going to take more than one afternoon. I don't know yet, she said. It was honest. Her phone buzzed. ICU, 4th floor. She picked up. Are you Nora Valdez from trauma? A nurse she didn't know well, day rotation. I have a patient asking for you, Bay 4. He's been asking since he came out of sedation. A pause. He's pretty insistent. She filed her last form and took the elevator up. What? Calvin Reese was awake, pale and diminished in the way surgical recovery reduced people. The body's resources redirected entirely inward, the exterior barely resembling the man they'd carried in on the stretcher. Lines in both arms, a chest drain, a monitor displaying numbers that were modest but stable. He turned his head when she came in with the careful movement of someone who had learned his torso was a negotiation with pain. He looked at her for a moment. I heard what you did, he said. Thin voice, getting there. You were unconscious, she said. You didn't hear anything. Briggs briefed me. He paused for breath. Short sentences for now, the lungs finding their capacity. All of it. She checked his drain output, looked at the monitor, touched nothing that didn't need touching. How are you feeling? Like someone repaired my subclavian artery. He looked at her. Who are you, actually? Nora Valdez, trauma nurse, Harwick Central. That's not what I mean. I know what you mean. She set the clipboard back. Right now what I am is the nurse telling you that the more you talk, the longer this takes. Rest. I'll come back tomorrow. She turned for the curtain. Valdez. She stopped. Thank you. Just that. No performance in it. The specific gratitude of a person who understood exactly what they were thanking someone for and didn't need to describe it. She stood at the curtain for a moment. Get some rest, she said, and came back through into the ICU corridor. She stood there for a moment in the managed quiet of the fourth floor. The monitors, the soft movement of staff, the late afternoon light through the windows at the far end. She was aware, in the way you became aware of things you'd been carrying without acknowledging, of the weight of the last 30 hours and what it meant and what still needed to be sorted out. Her phone buzzed, an automated HR email, the formal opening of the senior specialist position, name, description, salary, reporting structure. 2 lines at the bottom. Offer pending formal discussion. Please respond to confirm availability for interview. She read it twice, put her phone away, walked to the elevator and pressed the button for the ground floor. She was 3 steps out of the elevator into the main lobby when she saw them. 2 people near the main entrance. Not law enforcement posture. Something else. The specific quality of people who had arrived from somewhere that was not here and intended to be somewhere else shortly. A man and a woman. Civilian clothes. The bearing of people who had come with a purpose. The woman had a credential wallet open in her hand. The man was looking at Nora. Not the building. Not Fosse's agents. Not the movement of staff around them. Nora. With the specific look of someone who had been shown a photograph and was confirming a match. She stopped walking. The credential wallet's lanyard was not law enforcement, not any of the federal agencies she'd seen represented today. It was the color-coded ID system used by one particular branch of the Joint Interagency Task Force, the branch that operated without the oversight requirements applying to the agencies Fosse worked for. The branch the woman in the parking structure had told her, specifically, was not involved. Had told her. The man took a step toward her, unhurried. The step of someone who wasn't concerned about whether she ran, because they'd already determined she had nowhere to go that they hadn't accounted for. She looked at the woman's credential wallet again, confirmed what she was seeing. Then she looked at the man's face, at the specific quality of his attention, the way his eyes tracked her micro-movements, the practiced patience of someone running a very long operation who had just reached the moment when the patience paid off. 30 hours ago, she'd walked into Harwick Central through the side entrance for the start of an ordinary night shift. The woman in the parking structure had told her the branch wasn't involved, had told her specifically, as though the information was reassurance, as though it was something she needed to believe. As though it was something she needed to believe so that she would move freely through the morning, through the parking structure, through the sub-level, through Fosse's meeting, through the 2 o'clock, without changing her behavior, without going to ground, without doing the thing that people with her training did when they suspected they were being managed. She had been the asset, not the investigator. The whole morning had been the operation. The man was 6 feet away now. Nora looked at the lobby around her, the main entrance ahead, the corridor back to the elevator on her left, the side hallway to the service wing on her right, Fosse's agent somewhere on the floors above her, and not on this one. She looked at the credential wallet and the man's face and the distance between herself and the nearest exit. She had 4 seconds to decide. She took the side hallway. She didn't run. That was the first thing. The instinct was there, the pull toward the service corridor, toward the exit route she'd mapped, toward the 11 weeks of terrain knowledge that had already saved her once tonight. But running was a decision that answered a question she hadn't yet finished asking, and she'd learned a long time ago that answering the wrong question quickly was more dangerous than sitting with the right question 1 second longer. She stopped in the side hallway and turned around. The man was 4 feet behind her. He'd followed without urgency, which told her something. The woman was still near the lobby entrance, credential wallet lowered now, watching the hallway with the patient attention of someone covering an exit she wasn't particularly worried about. They weren't trying to contain her. They were waiting for something. "Valdez," the man said. Not aggressive. Not quite friendly either. The specific neutral register of someone who had run enough of these conversations to know that the opening tone set everything that followed. "You have about 30 seconds before I call Fosse down here," she said. "Fosse already knows we're here. She looked at him. Then why didn't he tell me? Because we asked him not to yet. He reached into his jacket. Slowly, deliberately, the movement of a person who understood exactly what that gesture looked like and wanted to de-escalate it, and produced a second credential wallet. He held it open at eye level and didn't move it closer. We're not here to bring you in. We're not here to pressure you. We came because the situation this morning produced a specific outcome that we need to discuss with you directly, and the woman in the parking structure isn't cleared to have that conversation. Nora looked at the credential wallet. Same branch as the woman's, but a different tier. She'd seen that tier twice in her career, both times in circumstances that had required her to sign documents she'd never been allowed to keep copies of. The morning was managed, she said. Yes. The parking structure, the file, the photograph of Caro. All of it was real, he said. Caro is exactly what we told you he was. The charges are real, the evidence is real. The operation this morning was real. He paused. The management was in what we didn't tell you, which was that Caro wasn't the primary source. He said it without inflection, the way people said things they knew were going to land hard, and had decided that cushioning the landing would only make it worse. He was the access point. Someone gave him the specific intelligence he needed to make the floor plan useful. Someone who had the operational context to know which details mattered and which didn't. The lobby noise filtered into the hallway around them. The ordinary sounds of a hospital afternoon, phones and footsteps, and the distant wheel squeak of a supply cart. Nora stood in the middle of it and felt the morning rearrange itself in her head, each piece shifting one position over to make room for the piece that had been missing. You were using me to find them, she said. We were watching to see who you led us to, not the same thing. He held her gaze. You weren't a target, Valdez. You were never a target, but you were the only person in this building who had the operational instincts to read what happened last night correctly, and we needed to see who you moved toward when you were reading it. And you moved toward Fosse, which was the right call, which confirmed what we already suspected about the second source and gave us enough to act. He paused. We moved on them 2 hours ago. She was quiet for a long moment. Who? He looked at her steadily. Not someone you knew. Someone who knew you, or knew of you. Someone who had access to your service record and understood that your presence in this building was either a significant coincidence or a significant asset and made the wrong call about which one it was. She absorbed that. Someone who had pulled her file, who had seen the specific combination of skills that had brought her to Harwick Central and decided it could be used, not against her exactly, around her. Are they in custody? She said. As of 2 hours ago, yes. Charged? The charging documents are being prepared. Given the classification level of what was accessed, the charges will be filed under seal initially, but the outcome will be public in the sense that matters. They will not be in a position to act again. She stood with that. It wasn't the clean public accounting she might have wanted. It was the version of justice that operated in the spaces between the versions that appeared in charging documents and press releases. The version that people with her background understood was sometimes the only version available. It wasn't satisfying in the way that simple was satisfying. It was satisfying in the way that real was satisfying, which was a different thing and required more from the person receiving it. What do you need from me? She said. A debrief. Formal, documented, on the record. Everything from the last 32 hours, from your first observation in Bay 2 forward. He paused. And after that, nothing. You'll be fully cleared. Your record will reflect the full scope of your contribution. And the agreement you made this morning with the woman in the parking structure, the part about being done, will be honored. She looked at him for a long moment. At his face, at the lobby behind him, at the light in the windows that was going amber now as the afternoon moved toward evening. When? She said. Tomorrow morning, we can come to you. Come here, she said. 8 o'clock. The consultation room on 3. He nodded. 8 o'clock. She walked past him back into the lobby without another word, and he let her go. And the woman near the entrance stepped aside, and Nora Valdez walked through her own hospital in the amber light of a Thursday afternoon and felt, for the first time in 32 hours, the specific sensation of a situation that was no longer running ahead of her. The debrief took 4 hours. She gave them everything, chronological, precise, without editorializing. The entry wound angle she'd seen on intake. The vital pattern she'd read while Hale was still repositioning his assumptions. The service corridor, the air shaft, the security hub. The 11 seconds in that room that had left her cheekbone the color of a bruised plum. She gave them the parking structure and the woman with silver hair. She gave them her read of Caro's behavior the night of the incident and the specific way he'd been standing in the north corridor. She gave them the morning as she'd lived it, not as she'd understood it to be while living it, but as she understood it now, the managed version and the real version running parallel, and what it felt like to have been moved through a sequence by people who had enough information about how she operated to predict her responses with reasonable accuracy. That part was uncomfortable in a way she didn't try to minimize. The man, his name was Delaney, he'd told her before they started, which she took as a gesture toward good faith, listened without interrupting. He asked 3 clarifying questions in 4 hours, all of them specific and technical, none of them aimed at anything except accuracy. When she finished, he closed his recorder. "For the record," he said, "your actions over the past 32 hours prevented 3 outcomes that would have been significantly worse than what occurred. 1 clinical, 1 operational, 1 intelligence-related." He paused. "That assessment will appear in the formal record." "What formal record?" she said. "You said the charges are sealed." "The charges against the secondary source are sealed. Your commendation is not." He looked at her across the table. "It will be filed with your service jacket and with the hospital's board of directors both." She hadn't expected the hospital piece. She looked at him. "Dr. Fraser's office requested it," Delaney said. "When we contacted them this morning to coordinate, he asked specifically that any federal assessment of your conduct be made available to the board." A pause. He was fairly insistent. She thought of Fraser in the conference room the day before, the weight around his eyes, the careful apology in the hallway. She thought of what she'd said to him. "Fix the environment. The apology isn't the part that matters." He'd been listening. "All right," she said. Delaney stood. "We're done here." He extended his hand. She shook it. "Good luck, Valdez." "With what?" He looked around the consultation room. The plastic chairs, the window with the view of nothing particular, the door that opened into the hospital corridor beyond. "Whatever you decide," he said, and left. She sat in the empty room for 10 minutes, not thinking exactly, not processing in any organized way, just sitting with the quiet of a space that had absorbed a lot of difficult hours and was still just a room with plastic chairs, indifferent to what had happened in it. She appreciated that about rooms. They didn't editorialize. Then she got up and went back to work. 3 days later, Neil Caro was indicted on federal charges of espionage, unauthorized access to protected computer systems, and conspiracy to commit acts resulting in bodily harm. The indictment was 7 pages long and named Harwick Central Hospital as the site of the primary intelligence breach. His name appeared in the headline of the Harwick City Tribune the following morning. "Hospital tech charged in federal espionage case linked to armed incident. His employment, his access history, his 2-year timeline of data exfiltration, all of it documented in language that left no room for ambiguity about what he had done and what it had cost. He was remanded without bail." Nora read the article at the nursing station at the start of her shift, then set her phone face down and picked up her charts. Deja, beside her, had read it too. "How do you feel about that?" she asked. Nora thought about it genuinely. "Like it's the right outcome," she said, "and like the right outcome doesn't fix everything that led to it." Deja looked at her. "Does it need to?" Nora picked up the first chart. "No," she said. "It just needs to be the right outcome." Bauchat. The board meeting was on a Thursday, 10 days after the incident. Nora was not invited to the board meeting. She was told what happened in it by Pauline, who had been summoned to give testimony about the department's internal culture and had delivered that testimony with the specific directness of a woman who had been watching a problem develop for years and had finally been given a room to say so in. Pauline found Nora in the break room afterward and sat down across from her and folded her hands on the table. "They've suspended the clinical authority structure pending a full departmental review," she said. "Hale retains his surgical privileges, but all decisions in the trauma bay, where attending assessment conflicts with nursing staff assessment, are now subject to mandatory second opinion before execution. Protocol, not discretion. Nora poured herself coffee. How'd he take it? He proposed it, Pauline said. Nora set down the coffee pot. He came to the board meeting prepared, Pauline said. He had a draft protocol. He'd written it himself, apparently, in the last week. It goes further than what the board was considering. It establishes a formal escalation pathway, creates a peer review trigger, mandates documentation of any nursing concern that's overridden. She paused. He cited your case specifically. The initial assessment disagreement in Bay 2. Put it on the record as a near miss attributable to hierarchical suppression of valid clinical input. The break room was quiet. Someone had left half a cup of cold coffee on the counter near the microwave and a sticky note that said Mike's. Do not on the handle of the cabinet above it. Ordinary things. The hospital continuing to be itself. He didn't have to do that, Nora said. No, Pauline agreed. He didn't. Why did he? Pauline looked at her for a long moment. I think because he's been living with what almost happened for 10 days, and he's the kind of person who responds to that by building a system, not by writing an apology he can file away. She paused. It's not the same as being a different person, but it might be the start of one. Nora sat with that. She didn't know if Pauline was right. She thought about how many people she'd known who had a crisis, absorbed it, and came out having made a structural change versus an emotional one. The structural ones lasted. The emotional ones lasted until the next time the pressure was different. Hale had made a structural change. The next test would tell her whether it held. The senior specialist position, Pauline said. I know. The board ratified it. It's real, it's funded, and the reporting structure is exactly what Fraser described. She held Nora's gaze. It's yours if you want it. I know that too. Do you want it? Nora looked at the coffee in her hand. She thought about what she'd told Deja, that she didn't know if she wanted to stay. She'd meant it when she said it. The honest answer had been genuinely uncertain, which was not a state she'd lived in comfortably for most of her adult life, and which the last 10 days had not fully resolved. But something had shifted, and she knew what it was, and she'd been working out how to think about it since the afternoon she'd walked back through the lobby, past Delaney and his colleague, and felt the situation stop running ahead of her. The thing that had shifted was this. She'd spent 7 years in the Army being exactly who she was, at full capacity, for an institution that used that capacity and rarely named it. Then she'd spent 1 year in Harwick City trying to be a smaller version of herself, trying to fit inside the walls of ordinary, and the walls hadn't fit, and last week had proved they never would. The question wasn't whether to be who she was. That ship had sailed. The question was where to be it and for whom. Yes, she said. I want it. Pauline nodded once. The expression on her face was not triumphant. It was the expression of a person who had waited a long time for the right thing to happen and was refusing to diminish the rightness of it by performing a reaction. Good, she said, and stood up. You start Monday. I'll need you to brief the night team on the new escalation protocol by Wednesday. That's 4 days. You've managed tighter timelines, Pauline said, and left the break room, and Nora sat alone for another minute with her coffee and the sticky note about Mike's cup and the ordinary persistent sounds of the hospital doing its work around her. She went to the ICU on her lunch break. Calvin Reese had been moved out of Bay 4 2 days earlier. Stable enough for a private room, still a week from any conversation about discharge, but upright when she came in and reading something on his phone that he set face down when she appeared in the doorway. You keep coming back, he said. Nursing rounds, she said. I'm not your patient anymore. Habit. She checked his drain output from the doorway, which she didn't need to do because she'd read his chart at the nursing station downstairs, and his numbers had been clean for 36 hours. She did it anyway. You look better. I feel like I got shot and had surgery in a hospital that was simultaneously under armed assault, he said. But better, sure. She almost smiled. Briggs said you're being transferred to a federal medical facility next week. Monday. He looked at her. Delaney briefed me about what happened. All of it. The morning, the parking structure, the secondary source. He paused. You ran the whole sequence and you didn't know you were running it. I knew something was off, she said. I didn't know the shape of it. Most people don't get off that lightly. I know. She stepped further into the room. How much did Briggs tell you about me? Enough. He studied her with the same careful attention he'd had when he first looked at her across the bay table, coming out of sedation. 75th, detached to JSOC, 5 operational tours, medical separation. He paused on the last one. That's the part he said was mine to ask about if I wanted to. It's the part that isn't in the unclassified record, she said. Do you want to tell me? She stood in the room and thought about it, not as a calculation, whether to tell him, what it would cost, what it would serve, just honestly thought about whether she wanted to say the words out loud to this specific person, in this specific room, at this specific point in the sequence of her life. Third tour, she said. We were extracting a compromised informant. The intelligence on the site was wrong, outdated by 6 hours, which doesn't sound like much until 6 hours is the difference between 2 guards and 7. She held his gaze. 3 people in my unit were killed. The mission succeeded. The informant came out. She paused. I filed a formal report on the intelligence failure. The report was accurate and complete, and it was buried by the same chain of command that produced the failure, and when I pushed, I was offered a choice between a quiet separation and a louder one. You took the quiet one, he said. I had people in that unit who were still active. The louder version would have caught them in the blast. She looked at the window. So I separated quietly, and I came here, and I tried to find a version of the work that didn't come with that particular category of cost. The room was quiet. The monitor at his bedside displayed his vitals in steady green lines that dipped and rose with the specific reliability of a body that had been brought back from the edge and intended to stay on the right side of it. The report, he said. The one that was buried. Yes. Delaney's office has been looking at a chain of intelligence failures over the past 4 years. 3 of them matched the signature of the one you documented. He held her gaze. Your report wasn't buried. It was copied. Someone up the chain kept a copy. It's been sitting in a classified file, and in the last 6 months, it's been part of a pattern analysis that has now produced 6 separate federal investigations. She stood very still. The people responsible for the failure on your 3rd tour, he said, 2 are already charged. The others are being built. He paused. Your name is in the file, Valdez. Not buried. Cited. Repeatedly. She had nothing to say. This was not a common condition for her, and she sat with the unfamiliarity of it, without trying to fill the space because some information needed room to land, and pushing it down before it landed was how people carried things longer than they needed to. Why are you telling me this? She said finally. Because Delaney wasn't going to, he said, and Briggs thought you should know. He looked at her directly. You pushed back on something that had every structural reason to stay buried, and it didn't stay buried. It moved. Slowly, and not in ways you could see, but it moved. He paused. I thought you should know that the thing you paid for wasn't wasted. She looked at him for a long moment. The bruise on her cheek had faded from purple to yellow in the last 10 days, which was the right direction. Her paperwork was current. Her patient's charts were updated. She was starting a new position on Monday that hadn't existed 2 weeks ago, in a hospital that was in the process of changing its protocols based on what she'd done in a trauma bay at 3 a.m. None of it was clean. The 3 people from her unit were still dead. The informant they'd extracted had lived, and the intelligence failure had cost what it cost, and the report she'd filed had moved through channels she couldn't see for 4 years before it produced anything she could point to. The right outcome had taken 4 years to become visible, which was not the same as justice arriving on time, but it had arrived, in the form it could arrive in, and she was still here to know about it, which was not something she'd always been certain would be true. Thank you, she said. Tell Briggs I said that. Tell him yourself, Cal said. He'll be here Thursday. She looked at him. You're still here Thursday? Apparently I'm not in as much of a hurry to leave as I thought. The almost smile again, more complete this time. Also, Okafor won't clear me until Friday at the earliest, so... Rest, she said. You said that last time. I'll keep saying it until it's not the right advice. She left the room and took the stairs back down to the trauma wing. 3 floors. The rhythm of the descent familiar in the specific way that the things you did every day became familiar. Not thought about, just done. The body knowing the route well enough to let the mind be somewhere else for the length of the journey. She came out on the trauma floor and Deja was at the nursing station, and the board was full and the afternoon had about 3 more hours in it before the evening shift started, and it was all just work, urgent and complicated and imperfect and never finished, which was the only version of it she'd ever found worth doing. Trauma in Bay 1, Deja said, without looking up. Hale's already in there. What do we have? MVC, male, 40s, chest, and abdomen. Deja looked up then. He's asking for a second assessment on the abdominal read. She stopped. Hale is asking? Called the station himself 10 minutes ago. Deja held her gaze. Asked if you were back from lunch. Nora stood at the nursing station for a moment with that information. Then she picked up gloves from the dispenser on the wall and walked toward Bay 1. She pushed the door open. Hale looked up from the patient's bedside. The trauma team moved around him, the familiar, concentrated motion of people working a case with genuine stakes. The monitors were on, the patient was conscious and in pain, and Hale had his assessment in hand, and his expression had the focused quality she'd come to recognize as him at his functional best rather than his defended worst. Valdez, he said. Abdominal tenderness, right lower quadrant, doesn't match the impact site. Take a look. She moved to the bedside, gloved, and ran her assessment. Systematic, fast, the patient's face tracked for response to palpation. She found what Hale was looking for in 90 seconds. That's not impact-related, she said. That's appendiceal. He's got a concurrent presentation. She looked at the patient. How long have you had that pain? Few days, the man said through gritted teeth. Thought it was stress. It's not stress, she said. She looked at Hale. You need a surgical consult while you manage the MVC injuries. The appendix is a separate clock. Already paged, Hale said. He said it without the particular register he used to use for her, the flattening tone that communicated hierarchy rather than information. He said it the way he'd say it to any competent person in the room. I wanted your read before they arrived. My read matches yours, she said. Good. He turned back to the patient. Let's get moving. She stayed in the bay for the next 40 minutes, her role clear and useful and not subordinate in the way it had been constructed to be. Subordinate in the functional sense, which was different, which was just the ordinary structure of a room where people did specific things and did them without ego because the alternative was someone dying on the table. This was the work. Imperfect, loud, technical, human, urgent, never finished. A man on a table with 2 things wrong with him, a team working the problem, and the constant decision to show up and do it correctly, even when correctly, was harder than the alternative. She had made that decision in a trauma bay 11 weeks ago, and she had been making it every shift since, and she would make it on Monday in a new role, and on Tuesday, and on all the days after that, until she decided to make a different one. The surgical consult arrived. She stepped back. The work continued. At the end of the shift, she sat in the locker room and untied her shoes and thought about nothing in particular for about 4 minutes, which was a luxury she rarely gave herself, and which she gave herself now because she'd earned it, and because nobody was waiting on her, and because the quiet of an empty locker room at the end of a long shift was its own specific kind of permission. She thought about a woman she'd known in her unit, a medic from Texas named Rosario, who had once told her, in the back of a transport vehicle somewhere she couldn't name, that the hardest thing about the work they did wasn't the danger. The danger was clean. It asked a clear question and you answered it or you didn't. The hardest thing was the invisibility. Doing the thing that needed to be done correctly, every time, and having the people around you look at the outcome and see anything except what had actually produced it. Rosario had said it matter-of-factly, not bitterly, in the way she said most things, like she was describing the weather, like it was a condition of the environment rather than an injustice, because she'd decided that making peace with it was more sustainable than carrying the weight of the alternative. Nora had disagreed with her, quietly, at the time. She'd thought that invisibility was something you tolerated until you could change it, that the answer was to push until the people around you were forced to see what was in front of them. She still believed that, but she understood now what Rosario had also been saying, which was that the work didn't wait for recognition to be worth doing. You did it because it was the thing you were capable of, and because people needed it done, and because the version of yourself that could do it was the only version you actually trusted. The recognition was not the point. The recognition was just sometimes what happened when you did the work long enough and loudly enough, and in circumstances public enough that the people who'd been looking past you ran out of places to look. She tied her shoes. She took her badge off its lanyard and set it in her locker and looked at it for a moment. Trauma Wing, Harwick Central, Nora Valdez. In small, ordinary letters, the kind that didn't announce anything. Monday. It would say something different. Senior Clinical Specialist. Still small letters, but different ones. She closed the locker. She walked out of the hospital through the side entrance, the same door she'd come through 32 hours before the night that changed the shape of everything, and the evening air was cold and specific and carried the smell of rain that hadn't started yet, and the freight rail yard across the street was running its last movement of the day, the long mechanical sound of something heavy being moved from one place to another. She'd built this life carefully and quietly and had nearly had it broken open from two directions at once, and what remained of it now was different from what she'd started with. Not better or worse in any clean accounting, just more honest, less constructed, more like the thing she actually was rather than the smaller version she'd tried to sustain. Some people spent their whole lives fitting themselves into the shape of what other people could see, compressing the edges, rounding the corners, making themselves legible to rooms that had already decided what they were looking at. Nora had spent 11 weeks doing that, and before that a year, and before that 7 years of a different but adjacent version of the same project. She was done with that project, not because the recognition had arrived, the commendation, the position, Hale asking for her read in Bay 1, Delaney's 4-hour debrief that ended with her service record amended to reflect what she'd actually done. Not because of any of that. Though she'd take it, she'd earned it. She wasn't going to pretend otherwise. She was done with the project because she'd walked into a trauma bay at 3 a.m. and a man had told her to stay in her lane, and she'd looked at a dying patient and decided that her lane was wherever the work needed her, and she'd been right, and she'd known she was right in the moment she said it, and she was tired of treating that knowledge like a liability. The rain started, small and cold, the beginning of something that would probably be heavier by midnight. She turned her collar up and walked toward the parking structure, unhurried, through the rain that was just rain and the evening that was just an evening, in a city that didn't know her name and a hospital that was starting to. And she carried herself the way she'd been trained to carry herself through every environment she'd ever moved through, like someone who had already assessed the terrain and found it manageable. She had work on Monday. She intended to do it well.